To give you a feel for working with the FlowLayout panel control, I'll start with a blank form. From the Containers tab on the Toolbox window, I'll drag over a FlowLayout panel control. From the Smart tag for the control, I'll choose Dock in Parent Container. And now my form contains a single FlowLayout panel control. From the Toolbox, let me pin this down so we can work with it, I'll drag a text box control onto the FlowLayout panel. Now note that with the FlowLayout panel, you can't control where controls go, it controls them. Even though I dropped it in the lower right-hand corner, it slapped it up to the upper left-hand corner. Let me add another text box now, and it can only go after the current text box or before the current text box. Because the FlowLayout is managing the layout, it wants to put it where it wants to put it. I'm going to add another FlowLayout panel control between the two existing ones, and there we are. Now, so we can see what this looks like, I'm going to set the border style property of the new FlowLayout panel to be, let's go back up there, to be fixed single, so we can see it on our form. From my Toolbox window, I'll drag on 3 more text box controls into that FlowLayout panel. Again, you got to be careful where you're putting these. Watch for that little marker there that tells you where they're going to go. I'll set the auto size property for this FlowLayout panel control to be true, so it'll automatically resize itself for its contents. And there we go. Let's run the project. Choose our test form, and now try resizing it. If I make it wider, then everything can line up on a single row. Here's our first text box. We have our FlowLayout panel control in here, and then another text box. If I make it narrow enough so the final text box won't fit, it of course will wrap to the next row within the FlowLayout panel. If I make this narrow enough so the entire FlowLayout panel doesn't fit, it goes to the next row. If I scrunch it down farther so the final text box inside the internal FlowLayout doesn't fit, it's going to scroll down. If I make this narrower so the second text box doesn't fit, it will scroll down. So I've managed to squeeze the life out of the contents of this form, and it all now appears in a single column. Now, as you might guess, working with nested controls can get awfully confusing. So you may want to use the Document Outline window to help you. If I go to View, Other Windows, Document Outline, you see here that we have our form, a FlowLayout panel, a text box, another FlowLayout panel. It contains 3 text boxes, and the final text box. So you can see the hierarchy of controls here, and it even makes it easier to select individual controls. For now, I'm done with that. I can shut these things down. I'll remove the controls from our test form, put it away, and now we can work with the pre-created form that shows off the behavior of the FlowLayout panel. I'll run the sample project and choose the FlowLayout panel demonstration form again. Let's start by looking at the flow direction property. The flow direction can be set to left to right, top down, right to left, or bottom up. Each of these values indicates the order in which the control attempts to lay out its contents. For example, top down will lay out the controls from top to bottom and then from left to right. So in this case, since Demo Button 5 won't fit below Demo Button 4, it has to go to the next column. If I make the form taller, however, Demo Button 5 now does fit. I can make it a little shorter, so Demo Button 6 doesn't fit, and it scrolls to the top of the next column. So setting top down behaves differently than choosing left to right. In this case, we go left to right until this button won't fit. It goes to the next row. If we make the form wider now, of course, Demo Button 5 will then take up space at the right-hand side of the form. The Wrap Contents property, set here, allows us to control whether the FlowLayout panel control wraps its contents or let the contents clip at the edges. If I uncheck this, then it doesn't attempt to wrap things, just lets things scroll off the side. And of course, if auto scroll isn't set to true, I don't even get scroll bars. At this point, our flow layout panel control isn't really doing very much. Let's turn auto scroll back on, and that controls when the scroll bar will appear. Let's make the form wider. So right now there's no scroll bar, but as soon as we get to a point where we overwrite demo button 6, scroll bars will appear. There, we just got there now. If we make this auto scroll margin larger, then we'll get the scroll bars sooner. No scroll bar here, or there, or there. Well, certainly 10 didn't make much difference there, but it does control how far out it will add the scroll bars for you. The flow break extender property allows you to insert a flow break, that is a manual break in the flow. So checking this checkbox is going to manually insert a flow break after demo button 3. Let's turn wrap contents on again, and now even though there's plenty of room for these controls to appear, because I've set the flow break on demo button 3, we now wrap after demo button 3. There is a set flow break method, and you call the set flow break method passing in the control after which you want the flow break and whether you want it on or off. Right now, when I check this, we passed in this control and a true. If I uncheck it, we call set flow break with demo button 3 and a false, and it removes the existing flow break. There's also a get flow break method, so you can determine if a particular control has its flow break property set. You've seen now a number of examples working with the flow layout panel control, and you can see how it makes it easier to create applications that flow much like HTML pages do on the web. The table layout panel control is the most advanced and most complex container control. It allows you to arrange controls in a grid-like fashion using a fixed number of rows and columns. It performs its layout at design time and at runtime, so you get a good view of what it's going to look like at design time. The contained controls can proportionally resize. Because the rows and columns within the table layout panel control can be set up to use a percentage of the size of the control, the controls within the rows and columns can resize accordingly. Setting up row and column styles is easy. There's a nice designer for this. And the contained controls receive extra layout properties. So controls like a text box can have a property so that it knows which row it's in within the table layout panel control. Let's take some time to investigate both the design time and runtime features of the table layout panel control. I've opened our test form, which has some controls left over from a previous demonstration. So I'll start by deleting those controls so we can start fresh. From the toolbox, I'll drag over a table layout panel control. Once I've laid it out here, you'll see it starts out with 2 rows and 2 columns, and I'll have this control dock within the parent form. I'll go to the dock property and set this to fill the entire form. You don't have to use it that way, but most often you will, and it's certainly easier to work with at this point if we have it fill the entire parent form. I'm going to place some controls within this table layout panel control. One thing to note is that each cell here can only contain a single control. If you need more than one control inside there, you should put a panel to fill the cell and then place other controls inside the panel. This is one place where that document outline window will really help. For now, I'll place a button in the left-hand cell and a button here, and then in the right-hand cells, I'll place 2 text boxes. There we are. Now let's go to each control and set some properties. For the 2 text box controls, here and here, I'm going to set the multi-line property to be true. So each of those text boxes can take up more than one line. I'll set all 4 controls dock property so that it fills its cell. There we go. So each one of them now fills the cell. Now I want to also set the cell border style for the table layout panel control so that we can see the border lines. To do that, we need to click on the controlling. That gets kind of tricky sometimes. We may have done it this time. Let's see. Looks like we did. If you find it difficult to click on the container control, you might want to use the document outline window. But for now, let's set the cell border style to be inset so we can see it while the form is running. Let's run the project. Bring up the test form, and note that as I resize the form, all the items within the form proportionally resize to take into account the size of the form itself. This happens because the table layout panel control is filling the parent, and each of the child controls is filling its container, the cell it's sitting in. What if you don't want the default styles for the columns and rows? What if you want more than 2 rows and columns? In that case, we need to do a little bit of extra work. Every column has a column style property, and every row has a row style property, and we can modify these. For example, there's a width or height property for each row or column, and there's a size type property, which identifies how much space it should take up. Let's try editing the rows and columns in this table layout panel control. Here in the task pane, I'll choose Edit Rows and Columns. This brings up the column and row styles dialog box, and here you see right now each column takes up 50%, and if I choose rows, each row takes up 50%. Let's start by adding a new row. There we go. Now we have a third row, and in the size type group over here, I'll set the size to be 100 pixels for that third row. If we look at the form now, you'll see that the bottom row takes up exactly 100 pixels, and the other 2 rows take up what's left. If I resize the form, the bottom section stays the same height, but the rest of the form resizes to make up for the fixed height of that bottom row. You can see here how we did that. If I go to rows, the third row has an absolute size of 100. You can also use a percentage, and auto size says have this row take up just enough space for the contents of the row and no more. Those are the 3 options for size type, and there's a height property which is the value here, 50, 100, and so on, and the size type indicates what that number actually means. When you add a control to the cell, by default it appears in the upper left-hand corner of the cell. You can modify properties of the control so it appears elsewhere within the cell. You can use the margin property, for example, to determine the offset of the control from the edges. So let's go to the second text box here, find its margin property here, and set it to 10, 10, 10, 10, and you'll see now it's got a margin of 10 pixels all the way around. We can set the control's anchor property also to none. There we are. So now it's not anchored in the cell, and it will just center itself within the cell. I can set the control's dock property to fill, and then it will fill the cell again. I can also set the control's top and left properties manually and set the anchor property to none to place the control exactly where I want it. I can also add controls programmatically to the table layout panel control. I have a demonstration of that. Let me save what I've done so far here, put this form away, and run the sample project. I have a table layout panel demonstration form here, and I'll call the controls.add method of the container to add a control at a certain location. I'll click Add Control at 1, 1, click it again, and we keep going to the next free location to insert the control. Well, I ran out of places to put it. Let's try once again so you can follow that. I'll add a control at 1, 1. 1, 1, of course, is right here. And there's the new button. If I do it again, it's hard to actually see, but what it's doing is pushing the controls over. It always inserts the new control here, but just pushes the control over to the next free spot when I do that. Now in this case, I'm also hooking up an event handler for each button so it knows what cell it's in. Let's look at the code to see how that's happening. Let's get some space so we can actually see something here. Down here is the button that adds a control at 1, 1. If we look at the code, we'll see the first thing we do is create a new instance of the button class. We set its text and its doc property, and now we attempt to put it at cell 1, 1. And the way you do it is by telling the table layout panel control to look at its controls collection, call the add method, tell it which control to add, and where to add the control. In this case, we'll also hook up an event handler, which calls the display position procedure. Let's look at display position. And the display position procedure calls the get position from control, taking the sender that's passed in, which is the button I clicked, casting it as a control. That returns back a table layout panel cell position object, and then I can get the row and the column from that. So the table layout panel control has a get position from control method. You send it one of the controls that lives inside the table layout panel control, and it returns back an object that has the row and the column that contains that control currently. There are some other properties you might want to investigate. I'll go back and run our form again, bring up that form. For example, there's row count and column count. You can add rows and columns, for example, though you can't see them yet. Let me add some controls, and then once we put controls in that row, we'll see it. There we go. You can't use these features to remove rows and columns. You'll need to explicitly remove the controls before you can remove the rows and columns. We can set the cell border style. Let me close this and start over again to make sure we have a clean version. And let me work with the cell border style. We can choose to have a different kind of border style. We can control the grow style. This gets or sets a value indicating how the table layout panel control should expand to accommodate new cells when all the existing cells are occupied. We can also play with auto scroll margin and auto scroll features, which add scroll bars as necessary. Now you got to figure, how does this control lay out its columns and rows? Let's go back to Design View and look at our original example. Let's close all these things down. Here, on this form, how does the table layout panel control know to lay out these rows and columns? If I go to the control and again choose Edit Rows and Columns, we have the option of having absolute sizes, percent sizes, and auto sizes. Well, the table layout panel control will always take into account the absolute sized rows or columns first and fixes those sizes. Next, it takes those with their size type set to auto size and fills those in. Finally, everything left over, it takes the percent size and allocates any leftover space proportionally based on the percentages. Now, of course, there still might be a last row or column, and if it needs to, it expands that last row or column to fill the space it needs. There will never be empty space on the right or bottom of this grid. To demonstrate this, let's clean up this grid a little bit. I'm going to delete some of these controls here. And now let's edit the rows or columns in this table layout panel control. And I'm going to delete everything so we have only one row and only one column. There's our one row. And there's our one column. We deleted all the columns. I didn't delete the rows. Let's delete this row and this row. So now we have one row and one column. Now let's add some rows and columns starting from scratch. I'd like here to have 4 columns. So we'll add our 4. There we are. And I want the first one to be 100 pixels. The second one to be auto-sized. The third one to be 50%, and the last one to be 50%. Now let's do the same for rows. For rows, I want 4 rows, so I'll add 3 more. The first one will be absolute 40 pixels. We're just trying some things here, go with me. The second one, absolute 40 pixels. The third one, 50%. And the last one, 50%. Let's see what it looks like. Here's what we have so far. Since that second column is auto-sized and there's nothing in it, you can just barely make it out there as a very narrow area where we could put something in there. So as we discussed, the control first lays out the columns with absolute widths. The first column is 100 pixels wide. Next, it sizes the auto-sized columns. The second one's auto-sized, and it has no width. Finally, the control takes all of the percentage-based items, we had 2 at 50% each, and it draws them in. So the rest of the size here is divided among the 2 final columns. Let's put a button in the upper left-hand cell there. And now let's see if we can put it into the column numbered 1, the one that currently has no width at all. Let's go to the Properties, find the Column property, and the Column property only exists on this button because it's within a Table Layout panel control. You know, buttons don't normally have a column property. And there we go. Now that there is a button in that column number 1, the size of the column has changed to make room just for that button, and the 2 percentage columns on the right have resized to split the difference left over. Controls get a number of extender properties because they exist within the Table Layout panel control. Let's look at that button and see what it got. It got the column property. It obviously got a cell property. It gets a row property. There it is. It gets a column span and row span property, which indicates how many columns or rows it spans. Let's make this 2. Make it so that it docks to fill. There we go. And you can see that that button now spans 2 rows within the grid. There's also a column span property which works just the same way. And now our button spans 2 columns. To try this out, I'm going to put these back to 1 and 1. Column span, because I have another control I want to play with. There we go. And I'm going to add a picture box control. I'll get that, drag it into this cell, and drop it off. Let's go set the properties of the image. I'll go here. It's the image property I need to set, and I'll choose a resource I've already added to this project, the water lilies picture. And there we go. I'll set the dock property of this control to fill the cell it's in. There we go. And in the size mode property, I'll set this to zoom so we actually see the entire image. And we'll set the row span property to 2. And there we are. And now we've filled up as much as we can of the picture box control, which is spanning 2 rows. Let's set the image control's column span property to 2, which will make it look a little better. There we go. As you can see, you can use the column span and row span properties to allow you to lay things out exactly the way you want. You'll find the Table Layout panel control useful for creating any sort of grid-like layout in a form in which you want to control the rows and columns. It's important to remember that you can have your controls span more than 1 row or column, so you can lay things out in a very granular fashion. The Table Layout panel control also supplies some methods that you might find useful. Because you can't interact with the control's extender properties at runtime, that is, there's no way for me to access this button's row or column property, and if we want to move the button, we'd need some way to do that. The way you do that is by using a method of the Table Layout panel control. Let me go over to our sample form, which is here, and look at some of the features on this form. For example, the Move Image to 0, 0 button will move this image over to here. How does it do that? It calls the Set Cell Position property to take a control and put it at a particular cell. You specify the cell using a new Table Layout Panel Cell Position object, and in the constructor, you tell it where you want this to go. So now if I run this and click the button, the image moves to cell 0, 0. There are also methods to get a column or get a row, to set a column or set a row. There's a get column, get row method, a set column and set row method. There's get column span and get row span to determine the row span or column span of an image. For example, get row span for picture box runs code that returns the row span of the picture box control. Let's see how that code works. If we look at that bit of code, it calls the get row span method of the table layout panel control, saying I want the information about the demo picture box. We can also set row span or set column span. We can also find out what control is in a given position. There's a get control from position or get position from control method. When we add a control at a specific location, say here, we add a control, there's code that calls the get position from control method of the table layout panel control to find out what position it got put at. Let's look at that code. That's here. You can see that we create a new button, and we just add it to the controls collection of the demo table layout panel control. Now, we don't really know where it is at this point. The display position method will do it for us. Let's go see where it is. This one calls get position from control given the control, and that returns back a position which we can use to determine where that control actually is. There's also a get column widths and get row heights method, which returns, well, all the column widths and all the row heights. Well, certainly, if you investigate all of the methods of the table layout panel control, you'll see that you have a great deal of power when laying out and interacting with this very complex and rich control.